story time. I got a call last Tuesday. A friend of mine, security director at a Fortune 500 mobility company, and he called me and said, I was obviously, as all of us, sitting upstairs in my attic, you know, behind the computer, blah, blah, blah. And he told me, like, Gert-Jan, I have an issue with the, that even though CTI exists for a decade, still my teams have difficulties in translating threat to risk and explaining that to me properly. I was like, no, are you really? And I'm like, okay, go on. And he tells me like, yeah, we're also using this thing called ATT&CK. Looks great, but I have no idea how to present it to my peers. I'm like, okay, that's interesting as well. That's interesting as well. And what I told him then is what I will tell you today in the next 30 minutes. And it goes a little bit like this. And I think, personally, I believe that we in the industry have a bit of an issue with storytelling. Telling a story about a threat and how to nuance it correctly and articulate correctly. What does it mean? What does it mean for everyone? What does it mean for the different stakeholders? And one of the things I found really useful, and that is what I explained to my friend, is that you could use things like MITRE, structured content in general, be way more effective in a concept I like to call threat-informed storytelling. And obviously, this is not easy, because otherwise we wouldn't be talking about these things. We would already be doing it, right? But that's what I'm going to be. This is the main takeaway. And all I'd like you to remember of me is that I'm a practitioner. I set up my own company focusing specifically on cyber threat intelligence advisory. And we help any company basically in building up their capability and understanding what is going on and making that actionable for their teams. I probably like a bit of Lego. You'll probably see that as well. If I was anything else, I would be a librarian. Fun fact. So, right, a bit of context setting. I personally believe that threat-informed risk management is actually quite hard. It is risk management is hard, but doing that based on threat correctly, that is even harder sometimes. And I see it as a balancing scale. A balancing scale that, you know, and probably all of you also in the digital crowd, you probably have witnessed, you know, the situation where you're doing your work and then all of a sudden somebody calls you and says, hey, what is this little thing? And you're like, yeah, okay, it's not a problem. Yeah, okay. But that is the kind of balancing act I see every single day where we balance out our understanding of the capability of an actor or whatever, or doing a lot of effort in structuring and standardizing it, but then balancing that with operational priorities, new incidents coming in. And the second thing, I'd like to also address the Lego elephant in the room. For those of you who know this is the Lego UCS Millennium Falcon. It is one of the most biggest, expensive sets of Lego on the planet. And why did I think that? Because I think it's sometimes a good metaphor, not always, but sometimes a good metaphor for what CTI actually is. It is a very costly effort to do it right. It takes time, it takes people, as we talked about yesterday, right? It takes people, process, technology to get it right. But if you put it in your collection, man, you have a good collection. You know, if you have it, call me. I like to see it. But what I'd like to emphasize is not that the Lego is cool, but I like to emphasize that it's very hard to do all of these things that are associated with one big object, and make it sure that it fits into your collection. That is hard. And what you kind of sometimes see is that by that balancing scale I just mentioned, is that it's difficult to get all the things that make a CTI team successful, to do all of those things right. And what I'm usually seeing is that teams then excel in one of these areas and then are basically so successful that they can't do the rest. And that is an interesting balance I find very interesting. Now, where is this going into? So I think, again, I believe that we sometimes struggle. I don't believe it sometimes. I think we always struggle as an industry with storytelling. And I think that especially from the threat-informed aspect, I think there's a couple of things we can do better. Coming back to my friend, these are some of the things I told him as well. At first, I personally love this slide because it helps me start the whole discussion about a threat, right? Do you even understand how people are talking about risk in your organization? This might seem obvious for most, but I can assure you that it's surely not. Every single day, every single week, I'm having discussions about these kind of topics to articulate what makes up a risk and how does threat equate to that. But my key takeaway here is that it doesn't matter which one you use, it matters that you understand it so that you can talk the same language. That is really important. Now, if we go into threat and try to understand or explain that to somebody who isn't even closely aware of what threat is, then I usually use a visual like this. You have an actor, has a capability and intent, you have a company. If there's an opportunity at that company, then if those collide, then you have a threat. Risk reasons inside out, threat reasons outside in. I keep it simple because usually this works best when I try to explain this particular bit. So one of the things you probably notice here as well is David's pyramid. Mean time to a pyramid of pain is probably now good, right? But what I like to say here is that if you go into the capability intent route, it's sometimes very difficult to explain that to people who really are not doing that kind of thing, right? And then all of a sudden you try to translate that into more tangible stuff, which could be attributed groups. People have a real motivation to target you, or yes or no. But also you have campaigns. And instead of just saying, hey, the pyramid represents things that could change often or are difficult to change, I usually use it in a different fashion. I use it in that fashion, but I also use it in a way to articulate like campaigns use TTPs, but they can change often and they can use multiple of them. And the thing is, this is exactly where you see the discussion happening from, hey, these are recognizable things. You know, these are the things the analysts actually recognize because they understand the below terms. The above terms are sometimes difficult. But it's about translating from fluffy intel content to nice and tangible stuff. And this is where you see structured content arising. Now, this is an overview, a simple overview. I tried to look at everything structured content related and came up with this. To be honest, I'm always lost in the weeds. If you would really look at this and think, hey, what are all the structured content options available? There's so many things. But I'd like to boil it down into something simple, and that's these three buckets. And the first one is you could actually look at it like, hey, we have certain frameworks and knowledge bases, and they use schemas and machine readable formats to encode everything. And what that basically means, just one example, is that you have ATT&CK. They structure all their data in STIX, and they encode everything in JSON. Just an example. I'm not going through all of these, and that is not, by the way, not the purpose of this talk, because I could go on for days. But the purpose, I think, is the most difficult, is to actually use this effectively in a team, right? So this is an interesting, I think is an awesome example. I made this with my friends of breakfast, and the idea is that this is just a briefing we give every single day, right? As a CTI analyst. But as you can see, that does not necessarily relate right to everything, right? And the issue of that is that if you try to translate that into structured content, it becomes quite difficult. And I think this is one of the issues where I see our Intel field struggling, is that how do you go from the qualitative content to the structured content? And I personally find it very interesting. I find this very fascinating. And for example, in this case, you could, for example, map the next steps. You could map certain activities, certain observables, but you cannot map an exact assessment. You have to put it in the description bar of, for example, a STIX schema. That is not really useful. And even so, the teams I work with, they ask me different questions. They don't ask me, hey, give me that nice briefing. They want to get more tangible stuff and understand how it relates to each other. And this is an overview of a friend of mine who made this and he presented about this in a conference last year. But what I actually want to illustrate here is that we usually give the thing in the orange box, but what people actually want to know is, what do we need to do about it? And that is pretty difficult. And now if you translate that into code, then it looks like something like this, which is absolutely unreadable for the normal person, right? But I think it's an interesting conundrum. And where I think this should be going towards is, we have these difficulties in getting more and more PDF documents, getting more and more emails, right? I struggle with that. Probably more of us struggle with that. And I like to reimagine that as say, hey, could we actually break it down into basically different chunks of information that we could, if we query a different question, then we could get a different output. Obviously, this is a real simplified example, but you probably get the point. And this is the kind of things I'd like to reimagine. Now, obviously, I told my friend, which I mentioned in the beginning, I told him like, hey, so how are we going to do this? Or do you want me to show you an example? And he said, sure, let me show you. So what I'm about to show you is more an example how I do this. This is not meant to be the example. This is meant to show my example. And I encourage you to find your own examples and try something, experiment, and let me know how that works, right? So in essence, I like my Intel deliverables to look something like this. Obviously, with not visually like this, but the concept of storytelling tells you that this is about a penguin, creating a penguin, right? It tells you everything you need to know about what is needed for that. It tells you the sequence. It tells you exactly how the different things fit together. And I find that a great metaphor to say, hey, this is how your Intel product fits in your team, in your organization. Obviously, it's a simplified example. It's not that simple, but this is the things I'm aiming towards. Now, what I did is I created a sort of like a framework aspect, a framework concept, which I call scenarios. I published it on GitHub, and people are free to grab it, free to use it. But my idea was, hey, let me just figure out how I can use it. And the reason why I created my own thing, because I wasn't really able to use all the different frameworks, existing frameworks together in a narrative format to explain to my stakeholders, like, how do I articulate threat to risk? So what I'm doing, I create a scenario format. I'm interlinking that with different existing structured threat content models, creating codified versions of that. And I collaborate with academia to extend this into the existing models, right? Because I don't want to create yet another framework, because there are like a lot, but I think it's really useful to get that going. And I'm actually trialing this right now in the private sector to see what works and get that going in real life. And how that then works for me is then if I actually are able to articulate, hey, this is what it's about. This is what this particular problem set is about. Then I can articulate, these are the components that are associated with that, right? What does that mean? That means that you have different blocks. You have white blocks, black blocks, small blocks, large blocks, wheels, etc. But you know the differences. And this is the kind of thing where the alignment of storytelling comes in, right? And in particular, the scenario, for example, I'm able to tag and annotate everything so that I can actually investigate faster. Now, even so, you probably have seen these kind of things, a playbook, an adversary playbook. I thought about this topic as well for many years, but the thing I found is that it's not really sometimes easy to explain simply, this is what group A does, and give an actor profile, and then translate that into how does that affect the teams in practice and have that discussion, right? But it is quite important. And why is that important? Because as you all know, any actor or red team or whatever, they basically find loopholes, right? They find a loophole to say, hey, how do we exploit penguin feet? Then we should probably start by, exploring the white block and then the black blocks, etc. But knowing that sequence and knowing those components, that helps you to actually understand. And you need to tag it all together. Now, thirdly, what I always use, and that's what I also told my friend, is a narrative-based explanation, a narrative-based context of what is going on. And this is very, very underappreciated in our industry. Why is it underappreciated? Because one, this takes time, and two, people sometimes want simple answers. But the reality is, it's not that simple, right? Because if you want to know where exactly, excuse me, where an exploit attempt happens, or if you get a report where certain findings are, and you get an explanation like, hey, we're exploiting penguin feet. Yeah, we did it by doing 1, 2, and 3. Click it all together, little loophole. But the discussion that is not often happening is, where are we defending? Is that happened in the latter stage of an attack chain? but where do we want to defend? Is that exactly, fixing it over there? Is that actually useful? And maybe we should fix it over there. Did the problem arise at stage 4, 3, or even 1, right? But that discussion does not happen often. It does not happen explicit. And narratives helps you to actually articulate that better. Now, one thing I also use, because I'm doing this kind of thing, that also helps me to analyze things faster. If I have a structure in place, then I can actually use it to search through all these scenarios. What I showed my friend is like, okay, so you're a CISO at a certain company, and you talk to me about, let's say, wipers, for example. That's the example on screen. Now, there's this tool called Obsidian. It's free, it's open source. Anyone can actually use it. But you could just load in the scenarios and you could start doing this now. It doesn't cost anything, only your time, right? But the thing is, I was able to pop up like, hey, this is my understanding of the latest malware, the wiper scene, and this is what has happened because it was all in the scenario. And I could be able to explain explicitly, hey, these are the steps people usually take. And that is also, that just takes time, but it saves you so much time. I think one of the things that is also very underappreciated sometimes is what you all already have in your organizations. We don't, sorry, my tip friends, we don't need the more expensive technology, or we don't need the most expensive technological solutions. We just need smart people and good process. That's my opinion, right? But sometimes automation is really needed, right? But why I'm asking you is to be creative. Right? This is an example of Jira Insights. And this is a asset management tool. Asset management, yes, an asset management tool. But everyone on the planet uses Jira, right? Maybe a show of hands. Who uses Jira? That's actually a lot. It's like 30% or something. And I think it is not just a ticketing system, it's also a knowledge-based system, right? You can also use the asset management function. But you could also repurpose it, and then you can actually, if you just change the labels, all of a sudden you have a threat tracking concept where you could relate threat to risk, to control, and then actually you can assess how effective your controls are. This is very underappreciated in our scene sometimes. We usually talk about the details, but we don't necessarily talk about how that rolls up into our organization. My key takeaway for all of you is look at your own team, look at your own technology stack, and be creative. If there's one person who's a very seasoned in Power BI, hey, have a chat with that person. Or with Jira, find something like this. Identify how your stakeholders are working, how they are operating, most importantly, where they are reporting into, and then you can link everything you do into that. That sometimes saves you a lot of time. Now, where is this all going, right? We talked about structured content. A structured content it was just one slide as I just presented it. And that is maybe an oversimplification, but I just want to say there's a lot of things going on in that area, but there's a few that stand out. And as we just saw in the quiz, there's only a couple that stand out, the hexagon model in particular, right? But what I'd like to also give you a bit of a takeaway is that there's also stuff happening that is actually taking all of that and going beyond that. And there's this model for workflows called CACAO. And I'm actually pretty interested in this kind of stuff. And why am I so interested in this stuff? Because it not just allows me to translate what is happening, like an incident or anything, and translate that into an attack sequence, and translate the attack sequence into smaller procedural level chunks of code, which then my adversary emulation teams can then reproduce in an environment. But it tells me the entire sequence, right? And what where this industry is moving towards is that you now are able to not just say, hey, this is the attack playbook, but this is also simultaneously the defense playbook. And this is new, this is novel in terms of what is going on. But where I think this should be going is For those of you who still remember the movie Minority Report, 20 years ago, right, where you have hand gestures where you could go through the data really effectively. I think that is where we should be going. And to be honest, we're not that far off from that. But the only way how we can do that is that by standardizing the research we're doing right now, making it understandable for also the machines that help us, the protocols, the algorithms, right? Last few days, we talked a lot about, with Beers, right? About things like certain machine learning models. But I'd like to emphasize that these are just tools to do our work faster, right? And especially if we get into these areas and we are able to, instead of just making a good incident report, if we're able to also codify that, then we can share it exponentially with different teams, faster, better, etc. And technology is hitting us fast, right? Technology is grabbing us from left to right, and we need to be ready. And they're way better. Skynet is way better than reading PDF documents probably than we are. So we better prep for that. No, I'm kidding. All I'm saying is this is the kind of area where I expect this all to go towards, that an area where the different existing frameworks collide into one, but focused on telling the whole story. Now, I'm going a bit faster than I was expecting, which is fine. That leaves some time for questions, but I'd like to send you off with a couple of key aspects which I personally think are very important. My main takeaway for you today is start doing this. Start thinking about this. The moment you get home, for those of you at home, like you can start today, you can start right now, right? But I'd like you to think about, hey, how can we do something different with our existing data set? Can we codify things, right? Can we maybe, instead of writing all sorts of reports and emailing it out to our teams, maybe we can already start codifying certain things and make it scalable internally, There's probably a lot of people who have some issues with actual sharing it, telling the threat story from one team to the other, right? And this actually helps you to then say, well, detection engineering teams, here are the procedures we actually need to investigate, and they're tagged to these particular techniques. And maybe risk management teams, these techniques are associated with these particular set of risks you are tracking, right? And I'd like to also emphasize that, people come to me, including my friend, and they said, yeah, but I'm not mature. And I'm like, no, that is not correct. Even so, people who call themselves less mature teams, they are more effective in adopting the change associated with these kind of things, right? And that's simply because it's much easier. They're sometimes afraid that, why should we do it? Second, and that is the key with this whole storytelling thing, is that you can align with the priorities of your stakeholders. This particular bit of storytelling is about stakeholder engagement and telling the right story with the right people, right? And making sure that people know if they want to know more details, then they can go into more details, right? But also being able to summarize upwards and actually understand what is going on. And I think there's, I also touched upon this, that it is sometimes needed to actually have machine readable sharing. Things like MISP, right? We cannot live without it anymore. Full stop, And I think this is the most important element, talking the right language with the right stakeholders. Finally, reimagine the approach you're currently having to storytelling. And this may sound so simple. I'm not expecting you to write the Disney products, by the way. So don't come back at me and say, hey, I'm making this thing. What I'm trying to tell you is that using a narrative format in intelligent deliverables is very effective. And especially if you don't have a lot of time to explain to your boss why one thing is more important than the other. If we're talking about certain stealers or whatever, and if we try to contextualize that in the current threat landscape, that is sometimes really hard, but it helps to tell a story. And the best part is they will remember it even better. Now, what will this all result into? It is quite simple. It will allow you to explain. You talk about penguins with their executives, and not just penguins, not crocodiles. No, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. You're talking about penguins, the right things. With the managers or people who actually need more understanding of the context, you could talk about sequences, right? You could talk about how one thing fits to the other, how it's all compiled together. And finally, talking about the detail-oriented folks, how does the little things fit together and how does that work? I'd like to leave it at that and open it up for questions. Thank you.